Horror has a special place where very few genres tap into our base emotions in quite the same way. That feeling of terror evokes a rush, and combined with the ability to play, to survive, and to run headlong into danger gets your pulse racing. It's fair to say that the Nintendo Switch isn't overflowing with gems in this area, but that's not to say there aren't diamonds waiting to be discovered. In this video, we take a look at what's out there and rank the choices helping you to find, or indeed to avoid, horror titles. Let's jump in and take a look.
Coming in last place, and one of the worst titles that I have ever personally reviewed, yes, it is Hollow. And not just by name, but also by nature. Any fear is replaced by frustration in this wreck of a title. The gameplay is disjointed and frankly not fun to play. A true horror of the game, and one that made me miserable for about 2 weeks after reviewing it.
Just like the title says, you don't want to pick this one up twice. Based on the film of the same title, they sadly didn't do it justice. The first 20 minutes or so start out well enough with a nice dark setting, but it doesn't take long for this to go downhill. Nothing really changes throughout the game, which is all set in one house, so the fear factor is replaced by a bore factor early on. Add to this serious issues with the controls and dull gameplay, and you're left with a title that's best avoided.
Hello Neighbour has a fantastic concept. With a bigger budget and a more experienced team, it could have been quite something. Sadly, a half-baked idea and a high price point leave us without much positive to say. There are a few high tension moments, and I could see a sequel putting things right.
Vaccine is a game that looks very similar to the original Resident Evil. It's a homage to a golden age of survival horror back on the PS1 with a fixed camera angle, limited resources, and set in a mansion. The recipe for success was there. The unique twist here is you have 30 minutes to find the vaccine in this procedurally generated environment. What lets it down is the frustration caused by luck. A good run means one where everything is laid out well. Add to this the clunky graphics and controls, and it's not going to be for everyone.
There is no denying Slender Man is an iconic character in horror circles. Originally released on other platforms in 2013, here it shows its age. This suffers from a classic horror problem, one in which the main enemy appears all too often, leading to annoyance. Here, it's not balanced well, and what we are left with is a competent but really forgettable and rather bland horror experience.
Now the bunker, as far as FMV games go, this one is interesting. You are the lone survivor and soon realise that it's not just the horror outside but inside of your bunker that you need to worry about. As a B-movie it's worth a watch, but as a game you feel that you are often forgotten. Your decisions feel as though they have minimal impact, which detracts from the overall experience. Often the tasks you are involved in feel rather mundane.
Waking up in a school to find everyone has disappeared and strange things are occurring ticks the boxes of classic horror. This one combines stealth gameplay, survival horror and adventure games into one package with mixed results. Hiding in a locker or other hidey holes as often as you need can be tedious, and the cartoony graphics, while nice, don't seem to quite fit the horror genre. This side-scrolling 2D title is quite interesting, but it doesn't reach its potential.
In this title, you play as a blind lady pushed into a horrifying experience. Cassie decided to face her fears and enters a surreal plot in which she is thrown into the history of the estate in which she grew up in. With an ever-present threat of the presence, it sounds on paper like a great idea. Cassie uses her cane to pick up on sound and produce an echo location of sorts. Unfortunately, in reality, the story is cliché and the mechanics are not as fun as they sound. Overall, this isn't a bad game, but it doesn't really stand out either.
Now the Count Lucanor, inevitably with any list you're going to come across games that blend genres. The Count Lucanor is one of those titles, a minimalistic horror adventure that blurs horror with dungeon quest games, and the result is an interesting if not fully realised title. It's slow paced and at times a bit clunky, but whilst not truly a horror title, it's a decent little adventure anyway.
When you think of indie titles, Limbo jumps to mind. The eerie silhouettes stand out in this short and satisfying creepy tale, and the port did it justice. While this one is one of the best games on this list, it isn't much of a horror title. It's creepy, but rarely makes you jump.
Now inside, the spiritual successor to Limbo, this is a case of more of the same good stuff. Even darker and more eerie, this tale is definitely one worth picking up. You can read the review on our website at www.switchwatch.co.uk if you wish.
This little gem is one that not many have played. It's a short point-and-click horror adventure that is both gruesome and charming at the same time. Some of the scenes are rather graphic, but due to the art style it gets away with it. I enjoyed this one from start to finish, and on sale at a ridiculously cheap price, it's one to pick up.
Like Limbo, Oxenfree is probably not best described as a horror, though it is certainly very atmospheric and spooky. This is a ghost story with multiple endings based on how you have adventured through its creepy tale. Time travel is used to mess with your mind, items will no longer be where they were before, for example, and it's told largely through the excellent voice acting. The Switch version adds a new Game Plus Plus feature, as well as touchscreen and HD rumble, making it a great addition to play on a long flight or train journey with your headphones.
Now, Layers of Fear, this is a horror game that uses what you can't see to build tension. It expertly builds an atmosphere through its wonderful use of sound and visuals, with the paintings themselves being a real star of the show. While the gameplay leaves a little bit to be desired at the end of the day, this is a walking simulator in that there could have been more for the player to do. By design, this is, as I said, a walking simulator for you to experience a very good horror story which will keep you glued until the credits roll.
From the same developer as Layers of Fear, the gameplay is very similar in Observer. Set in a dystopian world, this sci-fi horror has a great tale that will hook you. Whilst it is a walking simulator, it does it very well. The soundtrack stands out, and whilst not outright scary, it's a trip into the dark recesses of the mind, which is unnerving.
A gruesome and terrifying visual novel is a sentence you might not expect to hear, but it sums up Deathmark. The content is grim, there's dismemberment, child abuse and rape thrown in amongst unnatural. What makes it stand out is its exceptional soundtrack and how it builds tension into the decisions you make, a classic good sign of a horror. What DARKWOOD does well is making you feel alone, stuck out in the woods with terrors creeping ever closer. In this game, it's all about survival. With a day-night cycle and resource management key, the sense of oppression is strong. Rather than jumping out at you every moment, you will spend your days exploring, gathering items and reinforcing your house before the dreaded nighttime descends. Visually, it's not the best and it's far from perfect, but it's one of the scarier games released on the Switch to date.
Now, Detention is a game that I very much enjoyed, an indie game which can hold its own with the best. If you enjoy horror games, then this is an essential addition to your collection. A good story steeped in history, great audio, visuals and gameplay where you will enjoy solving puzzles and avoiding ghosts. It does miss that action element some will crave, and it's not the longest or most challenging game in the world, but if you're after horror, then turn the lights down, the sound up and enjoy this dark and twisted horror experience.
No horror list would ever be complete without the grandfather that is Resident Evil, greedily taking up 4 spots, starting with Resident Evil 0. Zero is a curious game, starting on a train under the earliest style of Resident Evil games. This prequel was never many people's favourite, but it's had a nice facelift and has found its way to the Nintendo Switch. Like all of the Resident Evil ports, the added benefit of being able to play on the move comes at the cost of some of the shine compared to other platforms, but that doesn't hold it back from being a classic Resident Evil experience.
Revelations is a funny one. There were 2 distinct games released and cobbled together with a lick of paint and some additional content. The first Revelations game was originally a 3DS release. It plays like a handheld experience, which is of course at home on the Switch with revamped HD graphics. The second title was released to consoles later on, and it shows in the game's graphics and mechanics. Equally at home on the Switch with a Doctor in handheld, this port was also well done. Both games follow the claustrophobic feel of the original titles and are a worthy pair of games to purchase in this bundle.
There is no horror title that has had a bigger impact than the original 1996 release of Resident Evil. As the game was not created to be widescreen, Capcom have jigged and poked to create a solution that trims it a little, but it still looks fantastic. Of course, the gameplay is as it was, complete with tough controls and terror in spades. If you picked this up today and played it for the first time, you would probably enjoy it but not think it's great. If you, like most people out there, remember this title, it's a great facelift to the absolute classic. Resident Evil 4 was a big deal coming out in 2005 on the GameCube. It was the first in the series to veer away from the fixed camera angles and switch to an over-the-shoulder, action-orientated viewpoint. It's a different animal from the titles that came before it, but it's still a classic to this day. Like Remake, it has a slightly cobbled solution around it to being made for widescreen, but it is a solid job that works well.
Little Nightmares, you play as a child called Six, waking up in a terrifying asylum you need to escape from. With no dialogue, much is left to the imagination. The atmosphere created is marvellous. The visuals and the way this game runs solidly in handheld or docked is an absolute pleasure, although loading times can be a little long. The little horrors that greet you are creepy through this nightmare, and you start to care about Six and making sure she stays alive. It's all those little interactions, small details that make this game so good. Platforming, solving puzzles while creeping stealthily past monsters make this one so compelling. Outlast again is a game that I reviewed, so make sure you check out the video if you want to know what our opinion was on this. But taking place in an asylum with just your trusty camcorder for much of the game, it is needed because of the night mode. This is a horrifying and creepy title that ratchets the fear up to 10. I know some people that can't play this for more than 5 minutes. It's a fairly on-rails experience with high production value, and it's a solid port to the Nintendo Switch. It does have its flaws. Sometimes enemies feel a bit too tough. It becomes quite repetitive later on, but it is a fantastic fright. Some prefer it to its predecessor, as it's a more claustrophobic experience compared to Part 2.
Outlast 2 builds on the original. It's longer, tougher, and has some darker scenes than its predecessor. Some of that game's frustrations are still here, and towards the end the same formula starts to wear thin, but it's part and parcel of this type of game, and overall this is a game that will get under your skin and make you scream out loud. It's truly terrifying, an example of what horror games should be, one that all horror fans should pick up if you can stomach it. Outlast 2 is definitely a brilliant game worthy of picking up.
Hey, the outsider!
And there you have it. It's telling that the best games on this list are ports and remakes. The Switch has some excellent titles.
But we're hoping for more in the future. Let us know what your favourite horror game in this list is down below.
We're SwitchWatch, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.